As we continue this look back on the old early days of the cabin, I thought this week I might look at some of the old slides and some of the new video that show so many of the improvements that have been made over the years. Many of these are depicted in different videos, but I'd like to just point out as we look at this picture of the cabin as it stands now. If we start on the left-hand side, you see there's a long thermal pane window along the side. There's some fresh logs that were replaced. Come around to the entrance, the front side here, and you'll see another nice vertical thermal pane window installed. See a nice door with glass panes and then an outer door that shuts to keep out the weather. You see a new roof on there, and you see that the cabin now sits a little higher. It sits up on stones, and these are all a lot of the big improvements that have taken place over the 35 years. Our backstory the last few weeks has been covering my time at the old cabin. But now we're really going to jump back to 35 years before I got hold of the cabin. This is back in 1951, and the person who owned it at that time, he only owned it for a year or two, but he was a young man, and he just got married, and he and his wife went back there, and they spent their honeymoon year, and he hauled timber out, and he did some trapping, like this bobcat that a neighbor in the north told me had a bobcat hanging around. So he went up and he caught that bobcat, and back in those days furs were really high priced, and so that was quite a thing to have accomplished, is to catch that bobcat. And so the picture that he saved for us as he put it on his truck. Jack only lived out at that cabin for about a year, and he logged it off, sold the logs, and he no longer had any use for it, so he sold it to the next group of deer hunters. But he didn't leave the woods completely. He was a logger out in that area, and I had the opportunity to run into him several times after I'd gotten the cabin, and he would tell me stories of the old time at the cabin. He said, yeah, when they bought it, he and his bride had both worked for a potato farmer, so they had a supply of potatoes. They had honey, and he said the meat was running by the front door. Jack's passed away, but his wife is still living, and a friend of mine has contact with her, and when he asked her about life out at the cabin, she just kind of looks at him and says, well, we were young and we were in love. The cabin in his 40 acres served Jack and his bride very well, but after about a year he had logged it off. He had hauled a lot of wood to town to sell, and so he advertised in a southern Minnesota farming paper to sell it as a deer camp. And this happy group purchased it and spent decades up there as their deer camp. Over the years, though, the roof on the cabin that Jack and his wife lived in and the one that the farmers, the hunting group, were using, the roof rotted, started to leak too bad, and they didn't probably have the time to really work on it and save it much. So over the years they started bringing some other tin up, and there was another cabin on the site, the one that I use now. And in Jack's day, it was his garage. Now it just sat out across the yard from the one he lived in. And this is a picture that I got from Jack of what my cabin looked like in 1951. Now I'm not sure. I suspect that at one time it was a cabin that somebody lived in, because I could see where there had been stovepipes in there and the way it was set up. But in Jack's day, he must have loved his car, because he had a 1940 Packard Coupe Deluxe, he said, and I think he carved out the end of the cabin so he could park that thing inside. And there's still a little bit of an oil stain on the floor where his engine leaked some oil down on there. But this is the structure then, that the farmer deer camp, that's what they called them up there, was the farmers. That was the farmer deer camp. They'd brought this tin up, and they put the tin on what's my cabin now. And that is the savior of all cabins in the Northwoods, because the roof is the first thing to go. So they set up their operations, and their hunting camp worked out of this cabin from probably the early 60s until about 1978 when so from 1978 until the 1985-86 when I stumbled across it. There was no one taking care of it. There was no one really visiting it. A few people knew it was there and they might stop back and poke their nose in, but there was no upkeep, and I think that's why when I found it after sitting there for 7 or 8 years, that's why it looked like this. In those 7 or 8 years, the weather took its toll. That tree that fell across, that didn't help. The local porcupine decided that it was the best outhouse in the forest, and it came to make its daily deposits on the floor in there. So it was quite a mess by the time that we got there to start sweeping it out and get some of the debris cleaned up. Kind of look around the yard, and some of the old chairs or a cot that were out in the yard, they were laying there. I'm sure that the farmer group, somebody thought, well, we'll be back shortly, we'll be back here again. But as time goes on, sometimes that just doesn't happen. Shortly after we'd settled up with Everett from the old deer hunting group on the purchase, cabin partner Richard and our really good friend Brad, they went up in the fall. I couldn't go along, I was still working at the time, but they went up with a plan and some tools and salvaging some logs out of one of the other old log cabin up there. They were able to fill in that garage door that somebody had cut out of the end of the cabin in the years previous. And Richard was a really good carpenter and a planner and a thinker, and he came up with a pretty good plan of utilizing things, and he brought up some windows to put around in the different places where there were some holes with just had plastic, torn out plastic in them. But here it was, he'd patched all this in, and you can see that now we have a window out to the front, and he took the old door and reinforced that, and it was just a single, well, it was 2 layers of wood thick, but it was just a one door, and that's the way that the cabin remained for many, many years. It sealed it up, it no longer blew in. It was rather dark inside because of there wasn't too much light in there, but we were content. It worked very well for us. If you've followed my videos at all, you know that my partners and I, we like to eat. So having somewhere to cook our meals back there was important. And our first stove back there was this 3-burner Coleman. We picked up a little Coleman oven that sat on top, and we roasted chickens and we made pizzas, and that stove worked out really well for us. And then over the years, we replaced the stove at our old farmhouse that was up in Minnesota. So on a wheelbarrow one day, I picked up the big range and I brought it back there and I got it installed at the cabin, but somehow I'd knocked some things loose on the way out, and the oven wouldn't work, and that was a real problem when we wanted to bake our cakes and our pies and our pizzas out there. So at a rummage sale here in Illinois, we found a little apartment-sized gas stove. And so I hauled it in and hauled that big brute back out again in the wheelbarrow, and everything was going a lot better now. We had facilities, we could really fix up a nice meal. We started gathering more supplies back there. You can see the kitchen's getting a little more gear piled in there, pots and pans. And not to be outdone though, I finally, at a rummage sale one day, I found this big stainless steel pan collection. And it gets a lot of comments about why do I need that many pans, but and I said before that one reason that I have all these pans on the wall is they help brighten things up in there, because that cabin was dark, and it was always everything we did was to try to make it a little bit brighter inside. Our sleeping arrangements were another thing that needed a vast improvement. We had these metal cots or beds that went clear across the back side of the cabin, and besides being uncomfortable, very noisy, and taking up a lot of room, well, they were ugly too. And we put up with it for years and years because, you know, we just weren't really into having the time. We wanted to go up there to ski. So as we came in, we just made do, and we would throw our little pads on top of those old noisy springs, and a little drafty in the back side of the cabin there too. You can see we left the cardboard up from the early days because it helped keep the wind out, and it did get a little drafty around those places. So the stove was smaller, and we just did what we can to try to keep the BTUs up. This little corner that I slept in when I had to. Remember, I slept outside with Wayne all the time, but that window was pretty drafty. The wall was pretty drafty. So worst case scenario, I might throw a blanket and hang it down from that top bunk to kind of keep it cooler in my little spot back there. But over the years, we took out all that. We took out the metal beds eventually. I took one side out, then I took the other side out, and then I brought in some big long planks from town on the wheelbarrow, and I made a big table back there. And then underneath that table that ran clear across the cabin, this is my little bedroom now without any pads down. But you can see I have an LED light, a few shelves. I have switches down there. I can turn the lights on and off underneath there. I can turn my radio on and off. It was a very luxurious place to be. This is after we had cleaned up the walls and got things cleaned out quite a bit. But you can see our sleeping quarters down under the table. And I kind of set it up that we could sleep four. Two could sleep on top of the table, and two could be down below. And that's worked out very well over the years. Although we've never had four, but we have had three sleep in those positions quite a bit. You can see that we also, as we did this operation, I'd been scraping the walls, and I just scraped every night. I would just scrape down and do a little sanding, and then we put some finish on them. And again, the whole thing was we needed to brighten that cabin up. And so a lot of the things we did, even the finish we used and how we sanded down and what colors we chose, it was all about trying to keep that cabin brighter. It was always rather dark in the cabin back in those days. The Coleman lantern, we had some mirrors set up and things trying to splash more light around, but the dark walls, they just have a tendency to suck up all that light, don't let it bounce around. We started changing things out, and we instead of the barn sash with the panes in it, we started putting these old storm door coverings on some of the windows. I think when I put this one in, I was putting a screw in the side, and it cracked, but we left it there for a while. And then I was able to come across to salvage a couple of the side lights off of a huge picture window. These were the vertical windows alongside. That's thermal pane, and it opens up with a crank, and so I brought that up and I put one on the south side, and then years later I took the matching one and I put it on the north side. But one of the things that really helped lighten things up in there was when I put the metal roof on, I cut a hole, and a friend had donated a skylight that he'd taken out of an old building. And that skylight really brightened up that cabin. I was tempted to put two in. In fact, I was in the process of trying to find one, but then I came across a big storm door at a rummage sale one day that was a real brute. And a friend of mine up north had a storm door that had gotten damaged in the wind, the hinges, and so I was able to salvage the glass out of that storm door. And I knew the measurements, and I cut it out, and then I inlaid that storm door glass into that hard wood framework of that door. And that, again, that really made a big difference. And then you can see the window on the right, we got rid of the panes, and we just had more square inches of light coming in. And the final thing to help brighten things up is, and keep things quiet from the hiss of a Coleman lantern, is we put the 12-volt LED lighting system in. And that really sweetened up stays at the cabin. Coleman lanterns are nice, but they are very noisy. This was the final window that was changed out just about a year ago. Tell you what, just looking back on all this work, I'm getting tired. I think I'm going to go and grab me a cup of coffee and just sit back like this. We'll finish up this story another time.